Let's take you live to a news conference now responding to those anti-Semitic attacks.
This happened right in the heart of Sydney's Jewish community. This happened right in the heart of people who, frankly, do not deserve to be the targets of this sort of violence. I understand people have strong views about conflicts right around the world, including the Middle East. But to target Jewish people in Australia is not a legitimate form of political discussion. It is not a legitimate form of participating in our democracy. To target the Jewish community in Sydney, in their homes, and on the streets, is anti-Semitism. Plain and simple. We are a multicultural country. We are better for our diversity. And every single person in our country deserves to live in safety and dignity and peace. That is not what happened on the streets of Sydney last night. I also want to say that I'm really pleased to be standing here with Dave Sharma. This is above politics. This is about the sort of country that we want to see together. This is about the sort of participation in our democracy that we want to see together. This is not about politics. This is about making sure Australians can be safe in their homes and in their streets. And the sort of vandalism and the sort of violence we saw last night has no place in Australia and is rightly condemned right across the political aisle. I'll hand over to Dave and then happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Josh. Well, the attacks we saw of vandalism and abuse of property and violence in Sydney's eastern suburbs last night is abhorrent, and it should be condemned by everyone. This is an attack that's designed to menace, intimidate and silence one group of Australians only. It took place in the heart of Sydney's Jewish community, and it has no place in Australia. This community of Australians, Jewish Australians, have been feeling besieged and under threat for the past year, and it simply has to stop. This is not only an attack on one community, it's an attack, as Josh said, on the values and the social compact that holds us all together as Australians. There are legitimate forms of political protests. There are legitimate forms of freedom of expression. This is not one of those. This has to be condemned, and I'm pleased to learn that the New South Wales Police have set up a strike force to investigate this attack. They are conducting investigations now. They are committed to hold the perpetrators to account, and they are treating this as a hate crime. I thought it was important to stand with my colleague Josh Burns today to emphasise what he said, that this should be a sentiment that unites us all as Australians. Our abhorrence and round condemnation of this sort of actions designed to menace, intimidate and harass one particular group of Australians. It has no place in Australia.
Any questions?
Do you think that the government's stance on Israel or criticism of Israel has created a climate where these kinds of attacks have been allowed to happen?
Mind if I go?
No, you go.
Yeah. Look, I would say that people absolutely have a right to have agreements or disagreements about government policy. Now, we are a democracy. We don't just enable discussion, we encourage it. And people have a right to be able to participate in our democracy in a way that is free and respectful and even purposeful. But what we saw overnight, where people are targeting Jewish communities in their streets, in their communities, in their homes, is not a legitimate form of participating in that democratic process that we hold so dear and is so precious to our country. So no matter what people's views are of conflicts around the world, we can't see that sort of conflict being brought to our streets in Australia.
The police are responding to this. Is there anything more you want to see in a proactive sense from the government, from authorities, to stop it happening again?
Well, look, I'd urge firstly residents who are there to cooperate with police if they have CCTV footage, to pass it over. If they've seen information that is of help to the police, to pass that over. But it's important as well that political leaders across the spectrum and at all levels, local government, state government and federal government, make clear just how unacceptable this is, because what we saw in Sydney's eastern suburbs last night, but frankly what we've seen in Australia over these last 14 months has tested our nation in a way I haven't seen it tested before in my lifetime. And it's incredibly important that we all cooperate to put this environment behind us and put it back in the bottle where it belongs.
No, I mean, there's this one very unsavoury incident. Officers like yours have been targeted more broadly, other MPs as well. This is, I guess, a broader issue than what we're talking about today. I mean, what more can be done by politicians, by government, by society, in a broader sort of social cohesion sense to sort of address this broader conversation, this broader issue that we're seeing here?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple of points to make. First of all, I know that every community in Australia wants to feel safe. Every multicultural community wants and deserves to feel safe. Every person in Australia wants to maintain and cherish that amazing multicultural fabric that makes up our country. And the sort of division that we've seen exacerbated in the recent times has really stretched that. And so I think working together and standing united as Australians is a really important first step. The other thing to say is that people need to be held account if they're going to do these sorts of things, and that this sort of violence is not acceptable. And I know that I've spoke to the New South Wales Premier's office this morning. They are liaising closely with New South Wales Police. I know that, as Dave said, New South Wales Police have stood up a task force to be able to deal with this. Certainly from my liaison with Victoria Police in the incident in my own office, they were treating these incidents really seriously. But if you are committing a crime, you need to be held account. And I will absolutely protect people's right to participate in protests and to participate freely in our democracy. What people can't do is the sort of violence, intimidation and vilification that we've seen escalating in Australia since for the last 12 months or more.
Jewish groups were among those who said the government's hate speech bill didn't go far enough because it doesn't outlaw vilification. Could I get a view from both of you about whether or not you'd like that to be added?
Look, I'd just say, obviously Josh and I don't agree on everything. Our parties don't agree on many things, but today we wanted to come together to speak about this incident and our unity of voice and purpose on these views. I'd like to leave other domestic political debates, legitimate ones, but to another day or another time.
But Josh just mentioned vilification. That there's a bill before Parliament that does not do what the government promised that it would do, which is to prohibit vilification on the grounds of religion. The status quo is you can't offend, insult or humiliate based on race, but you can on religion. Should that be fixed?
I'd make a similar point to Dave, Paul, is that that is an absolutely legitimate question, and there are parliamentary processes that will go under where our parties will try and negotiate and get outcomes, and I'll put forward my views as part of that, and I know Dave will as well. But today is about coming together as two different people from two different parties to condemn the sort of anti-Semitism that we saw last night. And the way in which we move forward is something that parliaments are going to need to grapple with, and I know that Dave and I will participate in that, but today we wanted to stand together on this particular issue.
Elements have been happening for over a year, that people have been besieged. Just seeing you're in touch with the Jewish Australian community, just wanted to see if you're thinking that this is still increasing. It's been a long time, but what's your take on that?
Jewish community leadership will be releasing their annual report on anti-Semitism in the coming months, and what we know is that it is increasing, and it's increasing at a rate that it never has in Australia. The sort of incidents that we're seeing against the Jewish community is escalating and intensifying. And last night, I know, would have made a lot of people in the Jewish community right around the country feel extremely unsafe, and that is something that motivated us to stand here together, to condemn it together, and to say that it has no place in Australia and that we need to stand against that sort of anti-Semitism and discrimination together.
I'd just add, there's no doubt that the Jewish community feels significantly less safe in Australia than it ever has. And attacks like this that are clearly designed to send a chilling message to them about leaving their homes, going to their places of worship, operating their business, whatever it might be, are only reinforcing that message. And that's why it's incredibly important that law enforcement applies the full panoply of resources at their disposal to identifying the perpetrators of these attacks and then holding them accountable for it, because we as politicians can send a message about this not being acceptable, but it's important that the law also sends a message of deterrence about what values and conduct and behaviour is tolerated in Australia and what is clearly beyond the pale, and this fits within the latter category.
Just on the social cohesion front, I mean, we have a very deep concerns about social cohesion. Peter Khalil has said he's worried about whether or not the election campaign could become highly charged or even dangerous at times. Not just on one side of politics, but do all sides of politics need to reflect on how they're managing this debate, including your own two parties?
Well, I mean, always we should reflect. The Australian political system provides for, and indeed should encourage and facilitate, a robust exchange of views. We have that in the Parliament, in our respective chambers every day of the week. But the idea of politics is that it's debate conducted without violence and without recourse to force, and with the settlement of disputes left to legislative processes and ultimately elections and the will of the people. And that's a very clear boundary that we need to respect and maintain at all times. So yes, as elected leaders, we should always be careful about the sort of language we use and the terminology we use, but we shouldn't resolve from legitimate policy debates and discussions, because that is how our political system is designed.
The only other thing I would add to Dave's answer is that, as a Jewish person, I'm equally offended by vilification and discrimination to other communities. I don't want to see any Islamic person or anyone of Palestinian descent being discriminated or targeted in Australia. And I think if we all hold this fundamental truth that we are all Australians, we all deserve to live in dignity and peace, and that as participants in our political processes, we need to stand up against forms of discrimination against any other Australian, I think we will lead ourselves in much better stead moving forwards, especially as we come into an election period. I don't want to see any Australian feel like they can't participate in our democracy, and I don't want any Australian to feel unsafe in their streets, no matter who you are and no matter what your background.
Between the government's position on Israel and creating this kind of climate where these attacks seem to be commonplace?
Well, look, I obviously disagree quite fundamentally with some of the positions this government has taken on Israel and the support to the conflict more broadly, but I would distinguish that from what we're seeing domestically. It's quite legitimate for us to have different points of view about how that conflict should be managed and what Australia's position should be on it, but what we have historically always been quite strict at maintaining and enforcing in Australia is making sure that overseas conflicts are not allowed to spill out into Australia, and differences of opinion about overseas conflict cannot be weaponised and used in force or violence against other Australians. And that is what we've seen way too much of in the last 14 months. And, predominantly almost entirely directed only at one group of Australians, Jewish Australians, because of their co-religiosity with Israel, and because some of them have views on the conflict with Israel. They're entirely entitled to have their views. They're entitled to live in their communities in peace, just as Muslim Australians are, just as Palestinian Australians. And if there was another community in Australia under equal attack or assault, I would be speaking up as strongly for them as I am today.